Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Okay, we've got some absolute bombshell breaking news today, and we're going to map out exactly what this massive, totally unexpected US-Iran peace deal actually means for the globe. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's just jump straight into the facts of this monumental agreement.
So the announcement dropped completely out of nowhere, and honestly, in a pretty unconventional way. President Donald Trump literally posted on Truth Social, declaring an immediate end to the military conflict and a lifting of the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ships. He capped off the post by saying, "Ships of the world, start your engines, let the oil flow." It's a massive statement, right? It caught almost everybody off guard and signals a hard stop to a conflict that has been, frankly, rattling the entire world.
Now, you might be wondering why this specific deal matters so much to your everyday life. Well, think about this. A massive 20% of the world's global oil and liquefied gas flows directly through the Strait of Hormuz. Because of this deal, that absolutely crucial waterway is reopening. That single metric is exactly why the global markets, and honestly, your local gas station down the street, are so deeply tied to this diplomatic breakthrough.
So, in this explainer, we're going to track the geopolitical ripple effect of all this across 5 areas: the surprise peace deal, Washington's motivations, Iran's hardline shift, Israel's unfinished business, and finally, the major outstanding questions.
Let's get right to it with Section 1, the surprise peace deal.
Okay, so obviously the US and Iran are the primary players here, but they definitely didn't pull this off alone. It was actually Pakistan's prime minister who formally announced the deal. Pakistan stepped up as the lead messenger between Tehran and Washington, and they had some really heavy backing from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. All of those countries provided immense diplomatic leverage to get this incredibly complex agreement across the finish line.
And guys, the timeline on this is moving aggressively fast. Pre-implementation talks are literally happening right now to lay the groundwork. This all sets up a formal signing ceremony in Switzerland this coming Friday, June 19th. Now, that signing kicks off a critical 60-day ceasefire window. It's really important to look at this as a ticking clock. It's a high-stakes period strictly designed to hammer out the incredibly complex technical details before things have a chance to break down again.
Moving right along to Section 2, Washington's motivations.
Let's take a look at the broader political landscape and what exactly pressured President Trump to finalize this deal right now, announcing it publicly on his 80th birthday, no less. The sheer weight of domestic pressure here is fascinating. The strongest push really seems to be economic reality back at home. U.S. inflation just hit its fastest rate in 3 years. Everyday Americans are feeling the pinch, with high gas and fertilizer prices driving up the cost of food and just living in general. Couple that immense economic strain with the looming November midterm elections, and you've got a massive political incentive to stabilize the global economy like yesterday.
To ease those intense domestic and global market pressures, this agreement demands the immediate termination of the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ships. And I mean immediate. There was talk earlier about a phased, gradual lifting of the blockade, but nope, this agreement demands an immediate opening. That swift action is intentionally designed to rapidly cool down global energy markets and get those supply chains moving again.
All right, let's look at the other side of the table in Section 3, Iran's hardline shift.
Turning over to Tehran, we find a really complex mix of emotions and a government fundamentally altered by this conflict. There's a stark contrast inside the country right now. For the general public, yes, there's immense relief that the bombs have finally stopped, but it's heavily mixed with deep anxiety. Thousands of people were arrested during recent uprisings, and exhausted civilians are terrified the ceasefire will just give the government the bandwidth to pivot inward for a brutal domestic crackdown. Meanwhile, the regime's posture is totally different. Despite the severe economic toll, the Iranian regime has emerged from this fighting noticeably emboldened, hardened, and way more assertive.
To really understand this, we have to look at an internal shift. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei died on February 28th, which, crazy enough, was the very first day of the war. That sparked a massive transformation in the country's power structure. Middle East analysts describe it as a shift away from divine power under cautious clerics to hard power dominated entirely by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Actually, scratch that, it's more like a total takeover by risk-ready military commanders. And you know, when you're negotiating with hardened military commanders instead of cautious religious leaders, finding diplomatic compromises gets significantly harder.
Let's shift our focus to Section 4, Israel's unfinished business.
Over in Jerusalem, this 60-day ceasefire is definitely not getting a warm welcome, and the friction almost completely detailed the entire negotiation. A major sticking point is that the agreement forces a halt to all military operations, and it explicitly includes Lebanon.
That means Israel is expected to immediately stop its military offensive against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. The tension here was off the charts. Just hours before this deal was announced, Israel was actively striking a Hezbollah command center in Beirut, which actually drew a pretty sharp rebuke from President Trump.
So, where does this leave Israel's leadership? Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had firmly promised his citizens the total elimination of existential threats from both Iran and Hezbollah. But the reality of this ceasefire stops well short of that. The Iranian regime is completely intact, Hezbollah is still a heavily armed, unresolved threat, and Israel is expected to just withdraw from its offensive. Netanyahu is suddenly incredibly vulnerable politically, facing fierce pushback from an opposition that's claiming he totally failed his stated mission.
Which leads us right into our final part, Section 5, the outstanding questions.
We have a memorandum of understanding and a cessation of hostilities, sure, but there is still an absolute mountain of details left totally unresolved. Middle East analyst Aaron David Miller summed up the mood perfectly by quoting Samuel Goldwyn, saying, "An oral agreement isn't worth the paper it's written on." It perfectly captures the skepticism out there right now. Everyone's thrilled the fighting stopped, but until these massive technical agreements are formalized on paper, this is effectively just a temporary pause in a much larger conflict.
And those missing details? They translate into massive hurdles for the next 60 days. I mean, negotiators have to figure out what to do with 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium, plus another 11 tons of enriched uranium Iran has amassed since the U.S. left the previous nuclear deal. That is just a staggering amount of material. They also have to address Iran's vast nuclear infrastructure and somehow agree on absolutely airtight verification mechanisms.
And it's not just the nuclear stuff. They have to bridge what negotiators are actually calling Grand Canyon-sized gaps on other deeply entrenched issues. Like, when does the sanctions relief actually kick in? Is it immediate or phased? What happens to Iran's advanced ballistic missile program? What about their continued financial and military support for proxy groups like Hezbollah? These are massively complicated issues that have basically defied resolution for decades.
All of this sets up a huge political narrative test for President Trump. Former President Obama recently spoke to ABC News, and he cast serious doubt that this new framework will look much different from his 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal, a deal that President Trump, as we know, heavily criticized. So from a purely analytical standpoint, Trump's challenge now isn't just finalizing the treaty. He has to prove to his domestic base and to international allies that he secured a fundamentally better, stronger agreement than his predecessor.
Which leaves us with the ultimate question. As the clock starts ticking on this 60-day window, is this a true path to a lasting peace agreement, or are we literally just experiencing a brief pause before the entire region explodes again? The whole world is holding its breath to see if these technical negotiations can finally bridge the gap, or if this massive announcement is just delaying a much, much larger conflict.